1960s, deep in the Nevada desert, a young U.S. Air Force weather observer named Charles Hall began noticing movement where there should have been none. Figures that he saw were tall, pale, and impossibly graceful. At first, he thought it was a mirage, but the longer he stayed at Indian Springs, the harder the truth became to ignore. What he saw was a race of extraterrestrial beings known as the Tall Whites, living in secret cooperation with the U.S. military. He claimed they had their own base, their own craft, and technology so advanced it blurred the line between physics and magic. What began as a routine weather assignment turned into one of the most extraordinary encounters in modern history. In the early 1960s, the United States Air Force operated one of its most secretive testing areas, the Nevada Test and Training Range. It was a vast and silent desert, stretching endlessly between the mountains, and it was here that a young airman named Charles James Hall was assigned as a weather observer. Fresh out of training, Charles was barely in his 20s when he arrived at Nellis Air Force Base. His task was simple on paper: measure wind speeds, launch weather balloons, record atmospheric data for experimental aircraft tests. He was stationed at a remote outpost known as Range 4, a lonely patch of desert near Indian Springs. According to Hall, he lived alone in a small trailer provided by the base, surrounded by miles of barren land and silence. Days often passed without seeing another person. His only contact with the outside world was the radio that connected him to base control. He followed his orders carefully, keeping his weather logs precise and his communication short. But the desert, as he would later recall, had a life of its own. During one of his early assignments, Hall began to notice unusual lights moving across the night sky. At first, he assumed they were flares or test flights. He thought to himself, "It's just another training exercise, nothing out of the ordinary." But these lights behaved differently. Somehow, they hovered motionless for long moments before fading away. Then he caught himself thinking, well, that's definitely strange. He mentioned that whenever such lights appeared, the Air Force ordered complete radio silence. No one was to speak, ask questions, or record what they saw. The rule was simple: observe the weather, not the lights. This policy of silence became routine at Range 4, and everyone stationed there knew it without needing an explanation. But for a man trained to observe and report, that silence felt unnatural. Hall began keeping a private notebook, recording details he could not include in his official weather logs, and something about them felt deliberate. Charles began to feel as though he was not alone. He described it as a physical sensation that someone unseen was watching him from the darkness. One evening, while stepping outside to check his instruments, he noticed footprints near the weather balloon launch area. They were elongated and narrow and much larger than standard military boots. The spacing between them was unnaturally even, as though whoever made them walked with mechanical precision. No other personnel was scheduled to be on Range 4 that night. The nearest camp was miles away. And from that moment, every night he went outside expecting to see something new, and he often did. Bright white flashes on the horizon, faint streaks of light gliding silently across the valley, and sometimes small luminous points hovering above the desert floor. They never made a sound, but the air felt charged like static before a storm. He also noticed that equipment failures coincided with these appearances. The anemometers would freeze. The radar displays flickered. The electric generator powering his trailer stalled without cause. Once, his compass needle began to spin uncontrollably, just as a bright flash appeared beyond the ridge. Hall didn't believe in coincidence. On several occasions, he reported these malfunctions to his superiors. The responses were always brief and emotionless. "Stick to your balloons," one officer told him. Questions were discouraged. Curiosity was dangerous. Hall understood the message. Whatever was happening out there, it was not his concern. By late 1965, his nights had become a mixture of routine duty and quiet dread. He performed his tasks by day, launching balloons, logging data, and reporting to Nellis Command. At night, he waited. He had stopped trying to convince himself the lights were ordinary. He saw intelligence in their movement. He thought to himself, "They're studying me, just as I'm studying them." The more he tried to stay rational, the stranger everything seemed to become. In his later reflections, Hall said that the Air Force must have known about the phenomena all along. He was convinced that the strict radio silence, the lack of investigation, and the careful isolation of his post were all part of a broader plan to keep certain knowledge contained. He didn't yet know what that knowledge was, only that it moved silently through the desert night, leaving traces of light and silence in its path. And so, night after night, Charles Hall stood beneath the vast Nevada sky, asking himself the same questions. He couldn't have known then that the lights he was tracking were not just phenomena. They were the first signs of the tall whites, and that the desert he called his workplace would soon become the stage for one of the most extraordinary encounters in military history. It began, as Charles Hall later recounted, with a slow unraveling of disbelief. It was the mid-1960s. He was 21 years old, stationed at the Indian Springs gunnery range, surrounded by sand, silence, and a sky so vast it seemed to erase the boundary between the world of men and something older. At first, he had heard only rumors among weather observers about a ghostly horse that roamed the ranges at night. They called it Range 4 Harry, a glowing, radiant creature that floated through the darkness.
A few knew they were there, but most of them just knew about the legend of Range 4 Harry. The legend of Range 4 Harry was that there was this giant, white, radioactive horse that floated around the ranges at night and was fluorescent, and supposedly was a horse that had gotten too close to the bomb blasts at Yucca Flats, and you'd see him on warm summer nights from a distance, and you could stay, but you needed to stay away from him. And he was called Range 4 Harry.
But as Hall would later confirm, there was an actual tall white guy with the name Range 4 Harry. The story, he explained, had grown from repeated sightings. He and the tall whites, Hall said, when they were wearing their protective suits, could form up into a formation that looked like a giant white horse. And I speak from direct experience, you would swear there was a giant white floating horse coming at you out in the desert. It was not a metaphor. It was the first tangible glimpse of them. But Hall's first true encounter came not at Area 51 proper, but at a small, almost forgotten weather station near Nellis Air Force Base. He was on night duty, a lonely post under an ocean of stars. One of the older airmen had warned him that the station was haunted. The man told him he had seen 5 tall white aliens come in from the runway, opening locked glass doors as if the air itself obeyed them. He thought they were ghosts, Hall recalled. He panicked and started screaming. When Hall was assigned to replace him, he expected nothing more than wind readings and boredom. But within days, the so-called legend became a reality. He described standing alone inside the building on a quiet Sunday night, when the atmosphere around him shifted. Outside, faint movement caught his eye. He turned toward the glass and saw a figure watching him from the edge of the tarmac. She was tall, impossibly tall, and luminous in the moonlight. Her skin appeared almost translucent. Milky white, he said, like porcelain that glowed from within. Her suit shimmered faintly, reflecting the light in soft ripples. That night, she did not approach. She simply stood there, watching him. And from that moment, he realized the desert was no longer empty. A few nights later, Hall walked back to his barracks after a midnight shift. Behind him, he sensed a presence. Turning, he saw the same tall white girl following silently down the road.
As I was walking back the mile or so to my barracks, one of the new ones being built, when I turned around, following me was the tall white girl, the 12-year-old. And I was about a quarter mile down from the base, from the weather station, and back by the white elephant was the teacher and 2 Range 4 Harry and another tall white guard.
Her movements were graceful and unnatural. She rose slightly above the ground. She lifted up, turned on her suit, until the tops of her feet were about as far off the ground as the top of a chair, he explained. Then, effortlessly, she floated across the grass. Hall's mind refused to accept what his eyes saw. He convinced himself he must be dreaming or sleepwalking. He remembered thinking to himself, "This can't be real. Not here, not now."
There was a time when I thought that the extraterrestrial lady I was looking at, that I was hallucinating. And I was kind of surprised because I was kind of thinking that if I was going to hallucinate, I was alone out in the desert, I was young and single, that if I was going to hallucinate, that it would be more like a Las Vegas showgirl, and she wasn't, you know.
But the figure remained, moving with mechanical precision and quiet curiosity. She bent forward, he remembered, and picked something up from the grass still floating in midair. Her movements were exact, like she was studying something invisible. It was in that moment that he felt stunned. The air around her shimmered as though charged by a static field. He turned away, unable to process what he had seen, and continued walking, half believing he was losing his mind. And from a distance, other tall whites observed him. Hall said they watched from near the hangars, silently supervising the young girl's approach. And for Hall, it was not an accident. They were intentionally showing themselves, he explained. They were testing me. The tall whites, as he would later tell it, were a family group, men, women, and children, who lived beneath the desert in underground facilities. And just like that, night after night, he saw movement around the weather station, flashes of white near the sand ridges, and luminous figures crossing the airstrip. Hall never claimed they spoke. The first time he saw a group together, he noticed how they interacted through silent gestures and bursts of sound too high for human hearing. If they feel like talking to each other using sounds too high for a human to hear, they'll do so, he said. If you didn't know better, you'd think they were using telepathy, because they'll be sitting there in total silence and one will laugh, and then they'll go through a complete conversation.
Because they'll be sitting there in total silence and one will laugh, and then they'll be going through a complete conversation. And of course, their electronics also are able to tell what a person is thinking and to put thoughts in the conscious part of their mind by electronic means.
Why do you think that?
From direct experience.
Over time, he realized that the tall whites carried advanced devices woven into their suits and helmets, capable of sensing and transmitting thoughts. In those early weeks, fear became his constant companion. He was alone at night, surrounded by miles of desert, with the knowledge that beings of unknown origin could appear at any moment. He described their presence as overwhelming. Each encounter left his instruments malfunctioning, his clocks off by minutes, his senses distorted. And yet beneath the fear, there was a growing sense of reverence and an awareness that he was standing at the edge of something extraordinary. Hall said he could sense intelligence in their behavior. They would follow me, he recalled, just to see what I would do. They wanted to know how I'd react. Sometimes, when they drew too close, he would back away, trying to maintain a respectful distance. He later told how he created small rules for himself, not to pursue, not to close the gap, and to sing softly when he knew they were near, to show he meant no harm. It was, in his own words, an understanding born of fear and curiosity. Over time, the sightings became less random and more deliberate. The tall whites, he realized, were allowing him to see them, to acclimate him to their presence. Their luminous suits allowed them to hover just above the ground, merging into one another's force fields until they appeared as a single shape. When they all turned on their suits, Hall said, the fields merged into one. You would swear there was a giant white floating horse. That horse, the same Range 4 Harry that frightened so many before him, was, in truth, a formation of adults and children moving together at immense speed.
I personally watched them when they wanted to go somewhere when they were out hiking, and they wanted to go somewhere fast, they could form up into that formation, and they could reach speeds of 100 miles an hour over the desert by floating up above the ground and just going zoom.
By the end of 1965, Hall's understanding of reality had begun to fracture. He was still a weather observer, still launching balloons and logging data, but each night his gaze drifted upward, toward the mountains and the stars beyond. And the more he saw, the less the desert felt like Earth at all. He later reflected that the true shock was not discovering that something was there, but realizing how long it had been here and why. According to Charles Hall, the beings he called the Tall Whites were not recent visitors to Earth. They were travelers, explorers who had made this planet a stop on a route older than civilization itself.
I'm certain that the Greys got here first and they were here before the last ice age, and that the Tall Whites got here second and they were here by at least the middle of the last ice age, and the Norwegians with 24 teeth got here towards the end of the last ice age.
To him, that meant tens of thousands of years, entire epochs of human history unfolding while these quiet observers watched from the shadows of the Nevada desert. He said they maintained a base at the northern end of Indian Springs Valley, an underground complex near a dry lakebed known as Dogbone Lake. From the surface, it looked like any other stretch of sand and rock, but beneath it, he claimed, lay hangars large enough to house their shining egg-shaped craft. This base, as Hall later understood, was their pit stop and a resting place between the stars. They would arrive, repair, and refuel before continuing their journeys across deep space. Hall described how, during the last ice age, the Greys and the Tall Whites both used parts of Nevada's vast dry basins as agricultural outposts. He spoke of ancient tunnels carved into the mountains, 13 of them, once used as granaries by the Greys, who he said were also plant eaters. The Tall Whites, by contrast, were more advanced. They built their bases underground for the precision and stability needed for interstellar maintenance. To Hall, this explained the strange logic of the desert. Why did the US government choose to place its most secretive military installations in such barren land? The area wasn't chosen because it was empty, he explained. It was chosen because they were already there. Over time, Charles learned that the Tall Whites' relationship with Earth was not colonial. They were travelers who just needed shelter between immense distances. They called it a stopover zone. From here, their craft could be maintained and crews could rest before continuing to planets orbiting distant stars, places Hall associated with Arcturus, roughly 36 light-years away. They'd be gone for weeks or months, he said, and then they'd come back. They used Earth as a port, not a home. In his quiet hours at Range 4, he began to think about what that meant. Maybe, Hall thought to himself, our world is nothing more than a service station on a cosmic highway. But that was just the beginning. Soon, Hall started to figure out many new things, and each one shocked him even more. For example, he realized that the Tall Whites live much longer than humans, perhaps 10 times longer. They matured slowly and aged with an almost crystalline grace. He believed that this different perception of time explained their cautiousness around humans. Despite their power, they feared us. Not physically, but unpredictably. He recalled that even those who had grown friendly toward him always approached with weapons drawn or protective suits engaged. In Hall's eyes, that fear was rational. To them, a moment of anger or confusion could end centuries of careful planning. They saw us, he once said, like we see lightning, beautiful, dangerous, and unpredictable. But despite their fear, they were not cruel. Their society, he learned, was built on rules of trust and patience. They valued predictability. Once a relationship of trust was formed, it could last generations, or to be more precise, for hundreds of years. Hall's time in the desert also changed his view of science. He came to believe that everything he witnessed challenged the foundations of human physics. And just when he thought nothing could surprise him anymore, Hall came to one more realization, that Einstein had been wrong about relativity. At first, this realization disturbed him. As a trained physicist, he had been raised on Einstein's principle that nothing could travel faster than light. But what he saw contradicted it. He had watched their ships cross the desert sky, vanish from sight, and reappear miles away within seconds. He calculated the distance and the timing in his notebook. Even his conservative estimates showed speeds far beyond light. He later explained that they were using forces we don't yet understand. And because of this, he began developing what he called the Hall photon theory, a concept he first copyrighted in 1997. In simple terms, Hall believed that Einstein's model of the universe was incomplete, not wrong in principle, but limited in scope. According to him, light was not governed by only two fields, electric and magnetic, but by several others that interact to produce effects not visible in classical experiments. He explained it with an example of a stone skipping across a pond. Einstein, Hall said, saw only the surface ripples, which are the visible waves. But beneath, in the unseen depths, were other movements guiding the stone's path. The tall whites, he believed, had learned to harness those hidden forces. They weren't breaking the laws of physics. They were using parts of it that people had not yet discovered.
And then take a few seconds, like 30 seconds, to power up completely the outer coils. It takes a few seconds to do so. When they do so, before they do so, the craft looks the way you're expecting. If you saw a helicopter out there, you'd see the actual metal of the helicopter. But after they're powered up, they just look real fuzzy white, like a tic-tac, because they're surrounded with force fields. You no longer see the actual metal, you just see the force field and the way it's fuzzing over light and interacting with it.
According to Hall, the propulsion came from coils embedded in their ships. When energized, these coils manipulated photons directly, controlling how they moved through those unseen fields. Once they were powered up, he said, they were ready for high-speed maneuvers. Their ships could cross 7 miles in less than a second, stop instantly, and reverse direction. It's not magic, he said once. It's engineering beyond what we can yet imagine. As he pieced these understandings together, Hall began to see the desert differently. The barren silence of Indian Springs became, in his mind, a bridge between worlds. The dry lake beds, the canyons, the wind-carved ridges, they were no longer just landscape. They were evidence of civilizations that had quietly shared this planet for millennia. He would often reflect on how seamlessly their presence blended into Earth's history. They did not build monuments. They left no temples. Their legacy was carved only in geology. Sometimes, while walking the ranges at night, he would imagine what it must be like to live hundreds of years, to see human wars rise and fade. And the more he learned, the more the boundaries between science and faith blurred. He became obsessed. He once wrote, "We are not the center of the story. We are one stop on its road." And though years later he would publish his experiences in the Millennial Hospitality series, he often said that the greatest mystery wasn't about them, but about us. Why were we chosen as their resting point? Why this small, fragile planet had become a station between stars? Perhaps, he thought, they saw in humanity what they once were, explorers still learning to listen to the silence of space. And as the years passed, Charles Hall began to understand not only who they were, but how their world worked. To him, the Nevada desert became a place where unseen machines lifted silently into the sky. He often spoke of the way they moved through that emptiness, not walking, but gliding, protected by a faint field that surrounded their suits. He described it as the field that could move further than light itself. That same field, according to Hall, was both shield and engine, a personal gravity shell that could lift and carry them across the desert without a sound. He often thought to himself, this same principle must have powered their ships. To him, that was proof that gravity was not limited by Einstein's speed of light.
But Einstein wanted to ruin that analogy by saying, to protect his own reputation, I guess, I have no idea why, trying to say that nothing could travel faster than light, not even gravity. But obviously, if gravity can travel further than light, it must be traveling faster than light.
Hall explained that the UFO's design had to be perfectly smooth, an ellipsoid, like an egg or a tic-tac, because any concave edge would create turbulence that could make the heating go to infinity. He compared it to an egg of glass, a seamless shell holding a bubble of force fields that stayed stable even at speeds, as though the speed of light weren't there. In Hall's words, once those fields were aligned, the ship could just continue accelerating, as though the speed of light weren't there. Hall was aware that many would never believe him, but he didn't care. Everything he had learned wasn't imagined in his mind, it was what he had seen around him over the course of several years. And as someone with such a rare experience, he could tell us more about those craft than almost anyone alive. During his years in the desert, Hall began to notice differences between the ships that appeared at night. Some hovered low over the sand, moving with quiet precision. Others stayed high in the sky, faster, larger, and far more powerful. He came to understand that they were not built for the same purpose. The smaller vessels were scout craft, designed for local travel. The larger ones were deep spacecraft, made for journeys across interstellar distances. Years later, Hall explained it plainly. The scout craft you see, like the ones for the Greys and the Whites, did not make the deep space crossing. Only the deep spacecraft did. According to him, the scout craft could move from place to place on Earth, from Nevada to New Mexico, or from one desert range to another, in minutes. The deep spacecraft, however, were entirely different in scale and design. He described one as being a little longer than this house, a little wider, with cabins inside like a ship at sea. In the front, he said, was the cockpit, control lights placed above, with the propulsion system in the back, designed to head out for stars 100 light years away. The smaller craft, in contrast, were designed for local exploration. He compared them to family vehicles. It's just meant to have a couple of teenagers take charge, put in 3 younger children, and go out and play. When Hall was asked how such craft could move so fast, his answer connected back to his own photon theory. He explained that the key was in the force fields themselves, layers of gravity and electromagnetism woven together. According to him, the ceramic fiber optics inside the hulls were wound into coils that carried subatomic particles, generating those fields.
And what you need is to have ceramic fiber. In your engine, you have to produce those. So you don't have just one engine, you have to have a way of producing all 5 of those. And then what you have are ceramic fiber optic cables. Ceramic fiber optics are 49.6% aluminum, 50.2% silicon dioxide, that's the same as rocks, and the remainder is the semiconductor, germanium, selenium, and so on that you use to coat those fibers with to create fiber optics. And then you wind those into coils. And whether you power up those coils or don't power up those coils, that's how you control and propel your craft.
To Hall, what he witnessed felt like the science behind miracles. He had spent years watching how their machines worked under the desert sun, and he became convinced that the key was in the materials themselves. They behaved unlike anything known on Earth, stronger than stone, yet clear and delicate like glass. In his mind, the glowing fibers that ran through the structure were not for communication, but for motion. They carried energy, not information. To him, this was the bridge between gravity and time, the hidden engine that allowed their craft to bend both. He often linked his discoveries in the Nevada desert to something older, like the mystery of Roswell. To Hall, the strange melted fragments found in 1947 weren't alien metals or memory alloys, as so many believed. One night, out on the range, something from his childhood came rushing back. He remembered hearing stories about the Roswell crash, and even seeing a strange fragment that adults said had come from it. Back then, he didn't understand what he was looking at. But standing there in the desert years later, watching that same shape rise into the night sky, he finally realized the truth. Whatever had fallen in New Mexico all those years ago, it was the same kind of craft, now hovering silently above him. One night out on the range, Hall realized something he had never really understood before. All that time, he had been searching for patterns, for proof that these beings were something more than human. But what he saw instead was their humanity reflected back at him. He noticed how they carried food, how they paused to drink water, how they moved with the same quiet fatigue that any living creature feels after a long shift. Later, he explained what that meant. They all have to eat, breathe air, drink water, and they all have to periodically go to the restroom, he said. Therefore, every craft in the back has a bathroom. It sounded absurd at first, a restroom on a ship that could travel between the stars. But to Hall, it made perfect sense. They were explorers, not gods. And like any travelers, they had built their ships for life. He remembered hearing people talk about aliens.